Hey Cafe Racer fans, thanks for your patience. We can get the clutch put back together now finally on my GS550 Cafe Racer. And what was the holdup? My shortened cable ended up giving me problems, and so I have moved away from this and I have ordered a custom-made cable from Motion Pro. I want to talk a little bit about this and the experience I had with Motion Pro, and then I'm going to make this video about cable maintenance. Motion Pro has a couple of options for lubricating cables that I want to share with you, and we'll get this clutch back together and hopefully ride the Cafe Racer by the end of this video. Welcome to Urban Monk TV. Okay, so again, thank you for your patience. I know a lot of you are following this build series and just want to see me ride the bike. I want to see me riding the bike. I think we can do that here. I've said from the beginning that this is a budget project, and every decision I've made along the way has been with budget being priority. And so I shortened my original cables, and that worked out fine in the case of the throttle cables for me, but I'm going to pull down my previous video on shortening the clutch cable because the ferrule on the end of my job has come off twice due to the resistance of the springs and the mechanism in this clutch. And you know, what if that had happened while I was riding? So at some point, in some cases, if you've got budget too far forward on your priority list, you can run into trouble. So that could be a safety issue. I no longer want to have that video up because I don't think it's in everybody's best interest. And yes, you can still build one of these on a budget and not spend mountains of money, but there are some places where you should spend a little bit of money. And cables they're control cables. Control is very important on a motorcycle for obvious reasons. So let's talk about my new custom-made Motion Pro cable. Okay guys, here's my old cable and my new cable beside each other. My experience pulling this out of the box is immediately I'm impressed with the quality of it. It's a very heavy-duty feeling cable. It comes with a protective shroud in the area where there's probably a little bit more expected friction or movement. So they've protected this against wear. The original factory one did also, but only in the shorter section. With my custom made, I got a longer section. I did not even have to request that. They had the foresight. So I asked them to, what I needed for the outside shroud length. I calculated that, but they knew just from the year, make, and model what size ferrule ends I should have, what length of free play I should have beyond the shroud on each side, and and they knew the ferrule end on this end. This is a real specific thing for this particular bike. They nailed it. I've got this shroud, the thread length on the adjuster is exactly right, and I really couldn't be happier with it. When I had taken my old cable, the original stock cable from this bike, apart and cut the inner and outer portions, you got the outer shroud and the inner cable itself, I measured that free play on both ends from the stock before I made any cuts, but in the process of putting that ferrule onto the cable more than once because it kept popping off, I ended up shortening that cable to a point where I believe the overall length of my inner cable was getting in the way of my clutch functioning properly because of where it was contacting the actuator. If you're rotating on a circle and you're already too short, well then when I pull the cable, I'm kind of pulling away from the circle rather than in a nice tangent to the outside of the radius, if that makes sense, and getting the maximum amount of push on the push rod into my clutch mechanism. So cable length matters. I don't know if that all made sense to you. In my head it does. And the guys at Motion Pro knew what that free play should be stock and were able to, whatever length I wanted, you can pick your length, they'll make sure that the stock free play is there when they're done making your cable for you. So I got a new cable, I'm going to install that now. And the representative at Motion Pro knew all the right questions to ask me. You know, I went into it thinking I know what to tell him, and he said, do you have the original stock handle, you know, your clutch lever assembly? You know, I didn't know that. I bought this bike used, but it's a good question, because if it had been changed by the previous owner, well, that'll change the geometry. They're thinking of every possible thing in regards to making this cable, and I was impressed with that. So I determined I do have the stock one, but I needed to know that, and they asked. So one of the things I learned, this point where the ferrule enters the lever is a very critical point on all your cables, in that if this action here, you see how it spins on a bit of you know, a radius here as I pull the lever, there's a little spinning there. If this ferrule, here's the original one, and you know, it's dry and not lubricated, if that's, and it's binding as it goes in, if that's in there and it's not rotating, well then what you're doing every time you pull the lever is bending the cable, and you'll get metal fatigue there eventually, and one by one the strands will break and it breaks on you. So what they did is include this nice plastic, I don't know what you want to call that, little sleeve, but it acts as a bearing in here and makes the action in here very smooth. The other recommendation for cable maintenance is lubricate this. Okay, so in spite of having this little plastic sleeve on here, I'm going to put just a little bit of lubricating oil, not much, onto this ferrule. That's plenty. Before I install it into the lever. Got the adjuster all the way down right now. I can tighten it up later. Very smooth. Turn that so it doesn't slide out of there. Okay, so now when I pull that clutch, that ferrule is rotating in there so that the cable is a straight pull and not a bend, if that makes sense. And on this end, again, this is a very custom end that you gotta, I'm not doing this right, it's gotta go through the cover first, but I want to show this, and it's hard to see with the cover. But this guy has to slide on there and it fits perfectly, and that's how your ferrule end fits into right here on the actuator. And so, you know, I didn't have to send them any measurements. It was fine if a guy wants to send them pictures. they're good with that, and I did, and measurements, but I don't think they really needed it. They knew this end. So I really couldn't be happier with the custom clutch cable service so far. And you guessed it, these threads match perfect. And now that I've got it threaded in, I can put on the ferrule end. Fits like a charm. There it is. And I can install my spring. I'll go ahead and put some oil on that too. So you see what I'm saying by having it pull too laterally. There. Once I get the cable all the way in, now I've got enough free play here to where when I pull the lever, I'm pulling on a nice tangent to the circle here, rather than, I can simulate when it was too short. When it was too short and it was like this, then I'm just pulling away from the circle rather than on a nice tangent. It's subtle, it's the slightest amount of difference in how much this actuator pushes this way, but it does make a difference. And gosh, the guys at Motion Pro just nailed the length of this, I think. Because if you look at the focus point, you know, the center of this radius, this circle, this lever is going just like that, which maximizes the amount of transverse travel. I love it. So I'm going to get this buttoned up and put the clutch cover on the other side and oil the engine, and then I want to talk about cable maintenance. Okay, cable maintenance, very important thing. Every time that inner cable rubs against the inside of the shroud of the cable, there's friction there. And how many times this cable in 42 years has gone back and forth and back and forth. And on my particular bike, I don't even know whether this is you know, the original engine. I don't know. There's a lot I don't know about this bike. This cable has a fair amount of resistance to it, but like I mentioned before, control cables are so critical. You want them running as smooth as possible, and you want to protect them from corrosion. Especially if you're in a climate where there's a reasonable amount of humidity all the time. That humidity will get in there between the inner cable and the outer shroud, and if it's an older cable like this, the inside of that shroud is not lined and protected from that moisture, and eventually you can get corrosion of the cable or the shroud inside that will just gum up the works and, God forbid, cause a break and then a complete failure of control of the motorcycle. I went ahead and ordered these. I got their cable lubricant, which specifically made for this purpose. In the past, I have put just like regular motor oil, like a 30 weight or something down here, and I got to admit, it's a little thick. I don't know if gravity is pulling it all the way down to the other end of this cable, which is, in this case, 40 inches away, but oftentimes they're even longer. It's a long way to go. Clearances are very tight in here. You want a lubricant that is thin enough and formulated to protect the metals, but not destroy a lining if you have a more modern cable that has an inner liner. And this stuff is formulated to do that. It will flow down, it will get to the entire length of your cable, and I went ahead and ordered that and 2 of their different versions of their cable lubers. So here's their original cable lubricator, Pretty simple thing. You open it up. It has a wider end and what appears to almost be a closed off end, but let me see if you can see that. Anyways, and there is the wider end. It's stepped inside of here for different cable shroud outer diameters, and essentially I can put this onto a cable at any length and it just slides right in there, and then slide it down to where it's going to be snug around that outer shroud, and I can tighten these up. And I'm clamping that rubber seal essentially around the whole outside of that shroud. At the top of this thing is a little rubber, well, it's molded into that inner piece, and there's a hole there that is meant to accept this little plastic tube from the lubrication, the can of lube, and it'll fit in there snugly, and you can spray and drive the lubricant down into the cable. And there you're starting to see it drip down the bottom. So now I know I've got lubricant all the way down that cable. It's a pretty simple thing. It gets a little messy up here, you know, it's not 100% sealed, but it got the job done. And you know, I've seen where you can buy kits of these two together. Pretty slick. Let's try this new and improved one. They call this V3. Cable Luber V3. Nice construction. Kind of a similar idea, except instead of crushing the rubber, call it a grommet, around the end of the cable with two screws this direction, it's using more of like a compression fitting, like you know, in pipe. And so yeah, you've got a little narrowing passage there, and there's a little reservoir in here, and here's a little hole on this end that your cable lube tube will fit down in. Whoop. So yeah, it fits in there, and essentially I can pressurize the whole inside of this. So let that set there for now. And inside here we've got that rubber grommet, and it can go around my cable. So the grommet can come out. I can open this thing up enough to get around just about any type of cable end, if that makes sense. So, you know, careful with this thing, don't tear it. That end on first. Then I can wrap this around the cable. Oop, I got it backwards. You want that taper up. And I want that around the end cap. Now I can feel that outer fitting is starting to snug up now around the cable. It has, you know, it's got a hex surface to it, so I could put wrenches on this. I don't know that it's necessary, frankly. Now, I want to make sure you can see this. Yeah, you can. Take my can of cable lubricant, put it in the top, and start spraying. Now I've got a plunger that popped up. You see that? And as I press the plunger down, I'm forcing it. Pops up when I hit the can. And I can push, and there's a pressure building up in that reservoir, and I am driving the fluid down that cable. I'll just do this a few times. But you notice it's not leaking out here, which is very nice. There we go. I could hear it at the other end. I don't know if you heard that. Thing works great. I love it. This thing's pretty slick. So hey, you got two options. This thing, it works. This thing works, but better. Either way, your cables are getting lubricated. Now, if I were doing this on the bike with the cable mounted somewhat horizontally, then I would prefer this one with the plunger, which forces fluid, over this one, which there is some force here because of the pressure in the aerosol can. But this one I'm able to apply, I felt like, a little better pressure. So I'm not going to say that this one would not be effective with a cable mounted on a bike. But I do believe from what I just did that this would be more effective. This is pretty slick. If I only had this one though, I'd be happy with it. So again, either way, my recommendation now is probably not to shorten your old cables. I'm going with the throttle cables that came with it because the amount of resistance on those and the spring and the throttle mechanism is just, it's really light and less of a concern to me. I know those ends are on good. But the clutch cable had a tremendous amount of resistance to it because there's some heavy springs on the other end of that cable. Well, the whole mechanism. And you don't want those ferrules popping off like happened to me twice. Thankfully it happened to me here in the garage and not out on the road. In talking to Motion Pro, I asked, you know, when you guys put those ferrule ends on to the cables, where am I, right there, you know, how strong are those? And he said, his answer to me was, we put them on so strong that, you know, you're gonna break your knuckles before you pop that ferrule off the end, or break something else in the system. So I feel really good about using a custom-made cable from the Cable Pros. And I feel good about maintaining my cables now and having the equipment to make that job easy. Can't wait to do it on my V-Strom, which I will be doing soon. In fact, I'll throw a video up on that later. So let's get this thing on the road. can I say? That was fun. What I ended up doing was holding in the clutch lever and dropping it into gear about 20 times, and 19 times the engine killed. The 20th time it didn't, and then I took it for a little ride, which you saw there. Hey, if you guys like what I'm doing, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to become an urban monk. Thanks for watching.